The great training hall of the Zyrith Empire was alive with noise, a vast chamber carved from black stone and lined with banners of conquest, where alien soldiers from dozens of worlds gathered in rows, their armor clashing as they moved, their tusks gleaming, their scales glistening under the pale light. At the center of the hall, a holographic projector threw images into the air, spinning stories of ancient Earth, of men and women who fought monsters and gods in the old human way. The soldiers roared with laughter, pointing at the images of fragile humans holding bronze swords against creatures larger than mountains, mocking the idea that such a soft species with skin instead of armor and bones so easy to break could ever have stood against anything real. They jeered at the tale of a man with a wooden shield facing a beast of fire. They howled at the story of a woman who led armies with nothing but faith and will, and they slammed their weapons against the floor in ridicule of the tale of a cunning sailor who outsmarted creatures of the sea. To them, these were nothing but fairy tales, weak stories from a weak species, an entertainment for soldiers who had fought real wars across the stars. They called humans prey, a world of children playing at battle, and the sound of their laughter filled the chamber like thunder. But at the edge of the hall, standing in the shadows, was Commander Ralvok, the war hero of the Zyrith, a being with scars across his jaw and a single good eye that had seen too many campaigns. He did not laugh. He listened in silence, his heavy hands clasped behind his back, his mind not on the holograms but on the memory of a battlefield far from this chamber. When at last the noise became too much, he stepped forward, his boots striking the floor like drums, and the laughter faltered. His presence was heavy, the kind that silenced even the proudest of warriors. He looked across the hall, across the rows of sneering soldiers, and his voice rang out deep and sharp as a blade. "You laugh at these stories because you do not understand them," he said, his gaze sweeping from one side to the other. "You think humans are frail. You think their myths are foolish. But I tell you this, those tales are the very thing that make them dangerous." The soldiers shifted uneasily, their grins fading. Ralvok pointed at the hologram still burning in the air, the figure of a human standing alone against a monster, and his voice grew darker. "I have seen one of them fight. I have seen one of them stand when every other warrior would have fallen. I have seen a single human make truth out of legend, and I swear on my honor it was no story. It was real." The silence in the hall deepened, the only sound the hum of the projector. The soldiers, who had been so quick to mock, now stared at their commander, uneasy at the weight of his words. Ralvok's eye burned with memory, and though he stood in the present, part of him was back in that fire, back in that moment when laughter had turned to fear. "You think you know what humans are," he said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "You are wrong. You will hear the truth now, and when I finish, none of you will laugh again." Long before the laughter in the training hall, the galaxy had already begun to tremble beneath the shadow of a new terror, a force that did not conquer with politics or promises but devoured everything in its path, leaving nothing but ash and silence behind. They were known as the Krith Dominion, a swarm of insect-like machines that filled the skies of a world until the stars themselves were hidden, their fleets moving as if guided by one endless hunger, their ships growing like living hives that spawned more and more until resistance was swallowed whole. Entire systems disappeared in weeks, their suns wrapped in nests of black metal, their planets stripped of oceans, forests, and cities until nothing remained but dead rock drifting in space. The proud Zyrith legions, who had crushed empires before, tried to stand against them, but their fleets were broken, their warriors scattered, and their generals killed in battles that barely slowed the swarm. The Krith were not an enemy to reason with or bribe. They did not retreat when wounded. They did not surrender when cornered. They only advanced, consuming every living thing in their path, and every battle fought against them seemed to end the same way, with fire and screams and silence. The galaxy, watching from afar, began to believe that nothing could stop them, that sooner or later all stars would burn under their shadow. Then their eyes turned toward Earth, a small world on the edge of known space, not remarkable for its fleets or its weapons, a world with ships that looked like toys compared to the armadas of the greater powers. The Krith did not hesitate. They swept down upon the system, confident that humanity would vanish in a single cycle, just as so many others had before. But this time was different, for in the heart of that small world was a man named Captain Elias Cade, a soldier who had lost much already, and who carried his grief like armor. his scars etched deep not only on his face but in his heart. Cade commanded the Terran Defense Force's battered carrier Resolute, a ship that had been patched and repaired so many times that its very hull told the story of desperation. Its crew, a mix of trained officers, miners, farmers, and engineers, pressed into service because there was no one else left to fight. He stood on the command deck when the first reports of the Krith arrival came in, the swarm spreading across the dark like a tide, and his crew looked to him, their fear plain in their eyes. Cade's voice cut through their terror, calm but strong, carrying the weight of something older than fear. "Remember the stories," he told them, his gaze hard as steel. "Remember that we were never meant to win against monsters, and yet in every tale we told we found a way. This is no different. We will not be their prey. We will be their end." His words spread like fire through the ship, from the bridge to the gunners, from the hangar to the engine room, and the people who had once been simple workers clenched their jaws and stood straighter, ready to fight. For Cade carried not just weapons, not just orders, but the old power of myth, the strength of belief that when all odds stand against you, you can still endure, still rise, still strike back. And so when the Krith descended expecting another easy victory, they did not find prey waiting for them. They found Elias Cade and a world that refused to bow. The Krith arrived with terrifying speed, their massive hive ships blotting out the stars, descending upon Earth like a storm. Their ships were vast, covered in shifting layers of dark metal that seemed to breathe with the pulse of the swarm, endless corridors of twisted alien architecture stretching across the heavens, full of mindless drones that answered only to the will of the queens. The humans, though vastly outnumbered and outgunned, had no choice but to fight. Cade and his crew on the Resolute knew that this would be their first and last stand. Earth had never faced an enemy like this, and they had no hope of surviving through sheer force. But it was not force that humans excelled at. It was cunning, bravery, and the unyielding will to survive against all odds. Captain Cade knew that they would have to use every advantage they had left. The Krith may have had vast fleets, but humans had something more valuable: ingenuity. Cade called for an immediate counterattack, but not one the Krith were expecting. The Resolute was no warship. It was a rusted relic patched together with scavenged parts, an old mining vessel repurposed for combat. The crew was mostly untrained soldiers, ordinary people who had once worked on farms or in factories. But Cade had led them into battle before, and each time they had won, not by strength alone but by their ability to think differently, to adapt. The first strike was a surprise. Cade had ordered every available asteroid mine to be rigged with fusion cores, sending them into the path of the Krith ships as though they were ordinary debris. At first, the Krith ignored the approaching objects, dismissing them as space junk. But when the first mines detonated, sending shockwaves through the enemy fleet, the Krith were caught off guard. The Resolute launched decoy drones filled with enough explosive material to make the Krith second-guess every move. Fighters, barely more than repurposed civilian ships, flew in unpredictable patterns, evading Krith fire and drawing them into traps. The human fleet might have been small, but it was quick and relentless. Every attack was a hit and run, each one making the Krith swarm hesitate, recalibrate, and fear. It wasn't enough to break the enemy, but it was enough to confuse them, to make them start questioning whether they were facing an entire civilization or a handful of defiant, angry humans. As the days turned into weeks, Cade and his crew continued to hit the Krith wherever they could. They sabotaged enemy supply lines, hacked into Krith communications, and used the terrain of Earth's moons to set up ambushes. There were close calls, too many to count. Ships were lost in battle. Many soldiers died, fathers, mothers, children who had taken up arms to defend a planet they loved. Cade fought beside them, a figure of unwavering determination, pushing forward with every breath, every ounce of strength he had. But it wasn't just about the war anymore. It was about survival, about proving to the Krith that humans weren't like the other species they had wiped out. They had something the Krith could never understand: the unbreakable will to live. And as the first hive ships began to crumble, as the Krith fleets took damage they had never expected, the galaxy took notice. Earth, the small world that no one had cared about, had struck a blow against the most terrifying force the universe had ever known, and for the first time the Krith began to hesitate. They did not retreat, but they were not as sure of their victory. Cade's name spread like wildfire through the galaxy. A man who had once been written off as a mere soldier had become the symbol of humanity's stubborn defiance. The Resolute was battered, its engines barely running, but it had done something no one thought possible. It had made the Krith bleed. The battle was far from over, but Earth had proven one undeniable truth. Humans were not easy prey. They were warriors in their own right, and they would fight until their last breath. The war dragged on longer than anyone had expected, and with each passing day, Earth's defenses grew weaker, but so did the Krith. The humans had become more than just a thorn in the Dominion's side. They had become an infection, unpredictable and relentless, forcing the Krith to fight in ways they had never been forced to before. Every battle was a struggle, each victory harder than the last. The once mighty Zyrith legions, who had once crushed entire empires, now found themselves struggling to hold the line beside humanity's makeshift forces. The Krith seemed to grow stronger with each attack, their hive ships multiplying like a cancer, and the swarm became more organized, more coordinated, adapting faster than humanity could anticipate. Entire cities on Earth were reduced to rubble, their survivors hiding in caves, in forests, anywhere they could, as the Krith scoured the planet for any remaining resistance. But still humanity fought. In the trenches and the ruins, human soldiers held their ground with a stubbornness that came from knowing there was no other choice but victory. The Resolute had become a symbol, its battered hull a testament to the people who had poured their blood into its repair, who had kept it flying when every ship around them had been destroyed. Cade led them, of course, but this time he wasn't just a soldier. He was the symbol of everything humanity had endured. The grief of losing loved ones, the anger of watching a planet burn, the hope that kept them going when there was nothing left but the fight. His face, scarred and weathered, became known across the stars, and though he never asked for it, the people rallied behind him. But Cade was tired. He had seen too much death, too much destruction. He had watched friends and comrades fall, his own crew scattered to the winds. Even now he saw the toll the war was taking on his people, the cracks forming not just in their ships but in their spirits. The Krith were relentless, and no matter how hard they fought, the war seemed endless. For every victory there was a loss 10 times worse, and yet there was something the Krith did not understand, something they could not predict. It wasn't just the humans' ability to fight. It was their resilience. Even when they were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched, they kept going. The human heart refused to surrender. It refused to believe in defeat. Cade knew this better than anyone. He had led them through hell, and now he led them into the darkest days of the war. He didn't have the luxury of giving up, even when everything seemed lost. As more and more of Earth was burned, as the last few cities fell, Cade began to realize that the war couldn't be won by defense alone. Humanity would need to strike back in a way the Krith would never expect. It would take everything they had left, the last of their strength, their technology, their courage, and their hearts. So Cade made the call. The Resolute, though heavily damaged, would lead one final assault on the heart of the Krith Dominion. The Star Forge, their giant moon-sized hive where the Queen spawned their endless armies. It was a suicide mission. There was no way the Resolute would survive the journey, and Cade knew this. But the humans had nothing left to lose. In the deepest parts of his heart, Cade understood the sacrifice they were about to make. This was it. The final chance. If they didn't strike now, humanity would be wiped out. But if they did, if they succeeded, they might just change the course of the war. Cade addressed his crew one last time, standing before them with a grim but determined face. "This is the final fight," he said, his voice steady despite the heavy burden he carried. "We may not come back, but if we do this right, Earth will survive. We will survive. We will fight until the very end. We are human, and we do not die quietly." His words, though heavy, carried a fire with them, something that had carried humanity through every trial they had faced. And so, with that single declaration, the final mission began. The last hope for Earth, for all of humanity, lay in one desperate charge to the heart of the Krith Dominion. The Resolute powered up, its damaged engines sputtering to life for one final battle. Earth's remaining fleet, a ragtag collection of ships and fighters, followed behind, knowing that whatever happened next would decide the fate of their world. The journey to the Star Forge was like sailing into the mouth of death itself. For the forge was no ordinary station, but a monstrous hive the size of a moon, pulsing with dark energy, covered in jagged spires of living metal where the Krith Queens spawned endless armies, their screams echoing across space like the sound of nightmares carried through the void. Every empire that had faced the Forge before had been annihilated, their fleets torn apart before they even came close. But still the Resolute pressed forward, leading the charge with engines burning and weapons armed. Around it flew a patchwork fleet of survivors, rebel Zyrith warships, mercenary cruisers, civilian freighters with guns strapped to their sides, and fighter squadrons manned by pilots who had nothing left to lose. They were not a proper army, but they were something greater, a coalition of those who had seen the courage of humanity and refused to live as slaves or prey. As they neared the Forge, the swarm came, black ships spilling out like rivers of fire, filling the stars with wings and claws, their weapons flashing in the darkness. The battle began in a storm of chaos, plasma bolts tearing through the void, ships colliding in desperate maneuvers, fighters darting between hulking hive ships like sparks in a hurricane. The Resolute charged straight into the heart of it, firing everything it had, tearing through wave after wave, its shields failing and its hull buckling but still pushing forward. The crew knew what awaited them. They were flying toward certain death, but not a single soul turned back. Cade stood at the helm, his face grim but steady, his eyes never leaving the glowing mass of the Forge ahead, his voice cutting through the chaos as he gave orders, calm and commanding, holding his people together with nothing but sheer will. Around him, alarms screamed. Flames licked the corridors. Wounded men and women dragged themselves to their stations, refusing to abandon the fight. Outside, entire squadrons were wiped out in seconds, their sacrifice buying only a heartbeat of time. But each heartbeat mattered. Each second brought the Resolute a little closer to its impossible goal. When the Forge loomed so large it filled every screen, when it seemed as though the swarm would consume them before they reached it, Cade gave the order that everyone knew was coming. "Prepare for ramming speed," he said, his voice calm as though he were discussing a routine maneuver. But in those few words carried the weight of humanity's last hope. The crew obeyed without hesitation, their eyes burning with the same fire that filled their captain, because they understood that this was not just about Earth anymore, not even just about humanity. It was about all life, about proving to the galaxy that there was still something worth fighting for. The Forge unleashed its fury, beams of searing light ripping through the fleet, tearing ships apart like paper, but the Resolute endured, clawing its way forward inch by inch until at last its nose struck the monstrous hull. The collision shook the ship to its core, but Cade remained on the bridge, standing tall as everything around him fell apart. The reactor was set to overload, the countdown already ticking, and he knew there was no escape. His final act was to open a channel to every ship, every soldier, every survivor still alive in the battle. His voice carried across the stars in the last moments of silence before the storm. "Remember the stories," he said, his voice strong, his eyes blazing. "Remember that we were never meant to win against monsters, yet we always did. We are human and we do not bow, not now, not ever." Then the Resolute's reactor went critical, a sun-bright explosion ripping through the Forge, tearing it apart from the inside, burning the swarm in a storm of fire and light so fierce it lit the skies of nearby systems. The shockwave shattered hive ships, incinerated fighters, and left only silence in its wake. The Forge, once thought eternal, was gone, destroyed in the blaze of one human's final stand. And though the Resolute was lost, though Cade's body was consumed in the fire, his words and his sacrifice spread across the galaxy like a spark, igniting hope in the hearts of countless species who would never again see humans as weak. When the fire of the Star Forge finally faded, and the wreckage of ships drifted silently across the void, the galaxy was left in a stillness it had not known for decades. For the first time, the endless swarm of the Krith was broken, their spawning ground destroyed, their endless tide shattered at its source. Across the Coalition fleet, survivors sat in stunned silence, their screens showing the glow of the Forge's last explosion burning like a new star. Many wept, some out of grief for the lives lost, others out of awe for what had been done. The humans had done the impossible. The Resolute was gone, Captain Elias Cade was gone, but their final act had changed everything. On distant worlds, news spread faster than light, carried by those who had survived the battle, whispered in taverns, shouted in marketplaces, told in hushed voices around campfires. People spoke of the ship that had charged into the heart of the swarm, of the human captain who had stood against an enemy that had devoured empires, of the last words he had spoken before vanishing into fire. At first it was just a story of war, a tale of courage, but soon it became something more. It became a legend. The myths of humanity that so many had mocked, the stories of warriors who fought giants, sailors who tricked monsters, men and women who rose against gods, were no longer seen as foolish fantasies. They were seen as truths wrapped in story, the heart of what made humans so dangerous, so impossible to crush. In the great hall of the Zirith Empire, where once laughter had filled the air at those old myths, silence now reigned as Commander Ralvok finished telling the tale of Cade and the Resolute. The young soldiers, who had once jeered at the sight of human heroes, now sat with wide eyes, their laughter gone, replaced by something heavier, something they could not quite name, fear perhaps, or respect, or maybe both. Ralvok stood before them, scarred and grim, his single eye burning with memory as he looked across the hall. "You think humans are weak," he said, his voice low and hard. "You believe their myths are nothing but fairy tales. But I have seen the truth with my own eyes. I have seen their courage. I have seen a man take legend and make it real. That is what they are. That is what you must understand." The silence grew deeper, the soldiers shifting uneasily under the weight of his words. Ralvok stepped closer, his voice rising. "The Krith are gone because of one human. Not because of our legions, not because of our fleets, but because one man carried the fire of his people's stories into battle and burned an empire to the ground. Remember that the next time you laugh. Remember that when you face death. Remember that when you think of what it means to be a warrior." No one dared to answer. The hologram of the myth still hovered in the air above them, but now it looked different. No longer a joke, but a reminder of what had been proven in blood and fire. And somewhere in the endless dark of space, among the ruins of the forge, fragments of the Resolute still drifted, carrying with them the last embers of its captain's defiance. Across the galaxy, Cade's name lived on, spoken with reverence and fear, his story told as both warning and inspiration. He had become what humanity had always believed in, a hero larger than life, a man who turned myth into truth. And though he was gone, his legend remained, a beacon to every corner of the stars, a promise that humanity would never bow, never break, never stop fighting. The Krith had been destroyed, but more importantly, the galaxy now knew the truth of humans. They were not prey. They were not weak. They were the ones who carried their myths into battle and came out the other side as legends.